At 1 hour and 44 minutes past midnight on May 7th, 2025, the Indian Ministry of Defense released a press statement that changed the strategic calculus of an entire continent. The statement was 4 sentences. It announced Operation Sindoor. And in the 22 minutes preceding that announcement, the Indian Armed Forces, in a tri-service precision strike coordinated between the Indian Air Force, Indian Army missile units, and Indian Navy targeting cells, had struck 9 terrorist infrastructure sites inside Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Simultaneously, in the dark, without warning, in 22 minutes. It was the most extensive and the deepest military operation India had conducted against Pakistan since the 1971 war. And this week, exactly 1 year later, 3 separate international think tanks published simultaneous assessments that the situation between these 2 nuclear-armed states is now more dangerous than it was before the first BrahMos missile left its rail. Welcome to the most underreported nuclear crisis on the planet. The anniversary context is critical because this week's reporting is not retrospective. It is a live warning. The Diplomat published 3 separate analyses in the week of May 17th to May 23rd, 2026. The House of Commons Library updated its Kashmir briefing for the British Parliament this week. The Carnegie Endowment published its final escalation dynamics report earlier this year. And Asia Times dropped the piece that should be on the front page of every defense ministry inbox in Washington, Tokyo, New Delhi, and NATO headquarters. China is exporting the J-35AE stealth fighter to Pakistan. Not the JF-17 Thunder, the existing Sino-Pakistani joint development that Pakistan has been flying for a decade. Not a technology-sharing agreement. An export deal for the J-35AE, China's carrier-capable 5th-generation stealth platform, the platform China spent 20 years and an undisclosed fraction of its defense GDP developing as its answer to the F-35. The platform that India has no current 5th-generation aircraft to counter. The platform that, sitting on Pakistani runways next year, will make the IAF's Su-30 MKI and Rafale fleet fight a stealth versus 4th-generation engagement in contested airspace for the first time in the subcontinent's history. A strategic trap, snapping shut over the Himalayas, one export deal at a time. But first, understand what Operation Sindoor actually did, because the 1-year anniversary reporting makes clear that the Western press, which covered Sindoor primarily as a counterterrorism story, fundamentally misread the nature of what happened. At 1:05 hours on May 7th, 2025, the first salvo of BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles, the joint India-Russia weapons system traveling at Mach 3+, capable of nap-of-the-earth terminal flight profiles that defeat conventional radar-guided SAMs, impacted 9 targets in a compressed 22-minute window. The targets included the headquarters of Lashkar-e-Taiba in Muridka and the headquarters of Jaish-e-Mohammed in Bahawalpur, organizations responsible for the April 22nd Pahalgam massacre of 26 Hindu tourists in Indian-administered Kashmir. But the Carnegie Endowment's February 2026 analysis and the ORF reporting cited this week confirms something the original press coverage buried. One of those BrahMos missiles struck Noor Khan Air Base in Chaklala, Rawalpindi. Noor Khan is a Pakistani Air Force installation. It is also located 1.6 kilometers from the headquarters of Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division, the organization that controls Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. 1.6 kilometers. India's BrahMos, traveling at Mach 3.1, covers that distance in approximately 1.7 seconds. India did not hit the Strategic Plans Division headquarters. India hit a target 1.6 kilometers away from the Strategic Plans Division headquarters. And every nuclear planner in Rawalpindi, and in Beijing, and in Washington, read that choice exactly the way it was intended. India is telling Pakistan that it knows where the nuclear keys are kept, and that it can get there in under 2 seconds if it chooses. Pakistan's National Command Authority convened an emergency session. Pakistan's defense minister went on television and said the word nuclear. Pakistan's retaliation struck 26 Indian targets over the subsequent 4 days, hitting Udhampur, Pathankot, Adhampur, and Bhuj air bases, using its own BrahMos equivalent and Chinese-supplied standoff weapons. India struck 9 Pakistani airfields in response on May 10th, targeting facilities from Skardu in the north to Rahim Yar Khan and Jacobabad in the south. This is the detail that the Stimson Center's 4 days in May analysis spent most of its executive summary on. The first time India and Pakistan have conducted mutual airbase strikes against each other. Ever. In decades of conflict over Kashmir, the doctrinal ceiling was always, do not hit the other side's main air bases. You can hit the other side's logistics. You can hit their forward positions. But air bases are where the nuclear delivery aircraft live. Hitting air bases is a signal that the nuclear threshold is being tested. Both sides hit each other's air bases in May 2025, and then they agreed to a ceasefire on May 10th. And then both sides immediately accused the other of violating the ceasefire. And then the guns mostly went quiet. And then, in the 12 months that followed, both sides did something far more consequential than anything that happened in those 4 days. Both sides rearmed, faster and harder than at any point in the last 30 years. Comment 1 if you think that ceasefire held. Comment 2 if you think the next conflict is already being loaded into the chambers. Here is what the Year 1 reporting confirms happened on each side of the line of control since May 10th, 2025. India expanded BrahMos production and opened a new integration and testing facility. India received the first tranche of deliveries for its second S-400 Triumph regiment from Russia, the same system that War on the Rocks reported in January 2026, as expected to arrive by May 2026. This week, India also began integration of the Scalp EG and Crystal Maze standoff missile systems on its Rafale F-3R standard aircraft, effectively giving it a fleet of deep strike platforms with stealthy profiles and ranges reaching past Karachi. India's PM Modi said publicly and repeatedly, "We have only paused Operation Sindoor." And then again, Operation Sindoor is India's new policy. These are not campaign rhetoric. These are doctrinal statements, delivered by a sitting head of government about an active military framework in the 12 months since a shooting war ended. The Diplomat's analysis from 3 days ago, May 23rd, frames this as a structural shift. The space for restraint in the India-Pakistan relationship is actively narrowing, and political incentives on both sides now reward aggressive posturing over de-escalation. On the Pakistani side of the line, the ceasefire was brokered by the United States, credited publicly and repeatedly to Trump personally by Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, who nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize for the mediation. Pakistan then used that diplomatic goodwill to quietly rebuild its relationship with Washington, which had frayed severely over Islamabad's connections to the Taliban and LET. While India refused to credit Trump for the ceasefire and insisted the conflict was settled bilaterally, Pakistan was working every back channel in Foggy Bottom. The result this week, a Pakistan whose international profile has, as the Diplomat notes, undergone a major makeover, while simultaneously conducting no direct bilateral communication with India since the shooting stopped. 0. No DGMO-level talks since the ceasefire. No flag meetings above brigade level. No back channel established to prevent the next incident from going kinetic in the first 20 minutes before anyone can pick up a telephone. And then came China. The Asia Times report published 2 weeks ago, amplifying the ORF March 2026 analysis. China is exporting the J-35AE to Pakistan. The J-35AE is China's fifth-generation carrier-based stealth fighter, revealed publicly at the Zhuhai Air Show in 2022, and now understood to have completed its export certification cycle. The aircraft carries an AESA radar, internal weapons bay for PL-15 beyond visual range missiles, has a radar cross-section comparable to the F-35 in head-on profile, and can supercruise in clean configuration. Pakistan currently fields the F-16C/D Block 52, a fourth-generation multi-role fighter that India's Rafale and Su 30 MKI can defeat at range in a beyond visual range engagement. Once J-35AE enters service with the Pakistan Air Force, and the reporting this week suggests that is a matter of time frame, not decision, that calculus inverts. Indian Rafale pilots will, for the first time, face an adversary they cannot reliably detect before that adversary has already fired. The strategic implications of that single capability shift are not tactical. They are existential in the most precise sense of the word. India's first strike deterrence, the ability to threaten BrahMos strikes on Pakistani airbases before those airbases can launch retaliatory sorties, depends on India knowing where Pakistan's aircraft are. If Pakistan's aircraft are stealth capable, India loses the clock advantage it demonstrated at 1:05 hours on May 7, 2025. The Asia Times analysis goes further, into territory that makes every arms control official who has read it put down their coffee. The J-35AE export signals a structural alignment between Beijing and Islamabad that is categorically different from the transactional arms sales of the past 20 years. China is not selling Pakistan a weapons system. China is selling Pakistan a strategic deterrent against India's conventional military superiority. And in doing so, Beijing is deliberately entangling itself in the India-Pakistan nuclear equation as a guarantor power, while simultaneously maintaining 50,000 troops along the line of actual control in Ladakh, where the India-China border dispute has never been formally settled. India is now looking, for the first time in its history, at a scenario in which the initiation of another Operation Sindoor triggers a two-front conventional response: Pakistan from the west, China from the north, against which no single defensive architecture, not even the S-400 regiment that arrived this week, provides adequate coverage. The House of Commons Library, updating its briefing for British Parliament this week, put the summary judgment in diplomatic language. The underlying reasons for the conflict are not solved by the ceasefire. That sentence is doing the work of a thermonuclear warhead in a parliamentary document. What it means, stripped of the Westminster prose, is everything that made May 2025 possible is still present. The Pahalgam attack killed 26 tourists. The organizations responsible for Pahalgam are still operating. The Kashmir dispute has the same unresolved legal status it has had since 1947. The nuclear arsenals are larger, not smaller. The communication channels are closed, not open. The Chinese aircraft carrier is in the Indian Ocean, not the Yellow Sea. And the man who launched Operation Sindoor is still the Prime Minister of the world's most populous democracy, with an electoral mandate that was strengthened, not weakened, by the strikes he ordered. Here is the question that the three simultaneous diplomat analyses, the Carnegie Endowment Report, the Asia Times piece, and the House of Commons Library briefing, are all circling this week without quite landing on. Not whether the next India-Pakistan crisis will happen. Every analyst agrees it will happen. The question is whether the next crisis will stay below the nuclear threshold in a strategic environment that has fundamentally changed since the last one. In May 2025, both sides demonstrated they could calibrate escalation and stop short of nuclear use. But the Stimson Center analysis noted that both sides were repeatedly surprised by the other's choices. Both sides sometimes read proportional responses as escalatory. The compressed decision-making timelines of multi-domain non-contact warfare, BrahMos arrives in under 2 seconds. An Agni 5 ICBM decision cycle in a crisis is measured in minutes. Make that miscalculation problem worse with every passing month. And now add a stealth fighter, and add a two-front scenario, and add 0 bilateral communication, and add a prime minister who has told his country that the doctrine is not deterrence. The doctrine is, we have only paused. At 1:05 hours on May 7th, 2025, a BrahMos missile left its rail. At 1:27 hours, 22 minutes later, the last strike package impacted its target. At 1:44 hours, the Indian Ministry of Defense said, "Justice is served." 1 year later, on a week in May 2026, 3 think tanks are simultaneously saying, "Not yet, not done, not settled." And China just handed Pakistan the aircraft that changes the clock. Watch this space.